On the morning of October 3, 2019, librarian Margaret Eloise Voss typed a dead man's name into a Google search bar and felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. By the end of this video, you will understand not just how a corpse checked out the same book from the Dunmore Public Library in northeastern Pennsylvania every single week for 11 years, but why, when the truth finally surfaced, investigators couldn't explain a single second of it. And what happened to Margaret in the months that followed that October morning is something the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office has never officially commented on. The Dunmore Public Library sits on the corner of Blakely Street and Warren Avenue, a squat two-story building made of the same gray limestone as everything else in that part of Pennsylvania. It smells the way all old libraries smell, like slow time, like paper absorbing decades of other people's breath. The heating system knocks and shudders every November when they first switch it on, and the fluorescent tube above the main circulation desk has flickered at the same irregular rhythm since 2007. Nobody has ever fixed it. It became, like so many small things in that building, simply part of the atmosphere. Margaret Voss had worked that circulation desk for 22 years. She was the kind of person a town like Dunmore produces with quiet pride, reliable, competent, unmemorable in the best possible way. She knew the Dewey Decimal System the way a surgeon knows anatomy. She remembered which regulars preferred large print editions without being asked. She kept butterscotch candies in a ceramic dish beside the date stamp, and she offered one to every child who came through the door. By all accounts, she was the institutional heart of that building. She was 54 years old in October 2019. She wore her gray-streaked hair pinned back in a loose bun, and she owned, according to her sister Carol, approximately 9 identical navy blue cardigans. She had never married. She had, in her own words, given her best years to that building, and she meant it without bitterness. The book was called The Long Dry Season, a slim, largely forgotten literary novel published in 1974 by a Massachusetts author named Gerald Fitch, who had died in 1989 with little fanfare and a modest readership. The Dunmore Public Library held a single copy, catalog number F441. It was a paperback, its spine long since repaired with yellowed tape, its cover a faded watercolor of a cracked earth landscape beneath a white sun. Nobody else ever requested it. In 11 years, it had never appeared on any waitlist, never been flagged for damage review, never been transferred to another branch. Every Thursday, the man who called himself Thomas Ruel checked it out, and every Thursday he returned it. Margaret had noticed him the way you notice weather, not with alarm at first, just a general awareness of something persistent. He came in at approximately 10:15 in the morning, always wearing the same style of clothing. Dark trousers, a pale collared shirt, a gray jacket that looked one season too light for the Pennsylvania winters. He was somewhere in his 60s, she estimated, with the kind of face that doesn't give you much to hold on to. Neither handsome nor plain, the sort of face you'd fail to reconstruct from memory an hour later. His hair was dark and slightly too neat. His hands, she would later tell investigators, were always cold. She knew this from the few times he'd passed the book across the desk to her, always with 2 hands, always with a brief nod that was almost formal, like a transaction at a bank. He never made small talk. He never browsed the shelves. He walked in, retrieved the reserved copy from the hold shelf, submitted it for checkout, and left. The whole visit rarely exceeded 4 minutes. And what the officers at the Dunmore Police Department said when Margaret finally called them, what one detective, a 17-year veteran named Sandra Qualo, later described as the single strangest sentence she had ever spoken aloud on the job, should have been impossible. Every rational framework Margaret had built across 5 decades of ordinary life simply stopped working when she heard it. Thomas Ruel had first checked out The Long Dry Season on September 6, 2008. According to his death certificate, filed in Lackawanna County on August 29, 2008, Thomas Ruel had been dead for 8 days by then. But that was only the beginning of what Margaret found, because the library card, the physical card with his signature on the back, had been issued in 1987, 21 years before his recorded death. And the signature on that card matched, in every measurable detail, the signature on his death certificate. The handwriting of a man who, by every official record, had signed his name exactly the same way for 32 years without aging a single day. Margaret didn't sleep that night, or the night after, She sat at the kitchen table of her small house on Prospect Avenue with a cup of tea that went cold in her hands, staring at a printout of Thomas Ruel's death certificate that she had requested from the Lackawanna County Records Office that same afternoon, October 3, 2019. The clerk who had handed it to her had asked if she was all right. Margaret had said yes. She had not been all right. The certificate listed his cause of death as cardiac arrest. It listed his age at time of death as 61 years old. It listed his place of residence as 14 Carbondale Road, Dunmore, a street Margaret knew, a street she had driven down 100 times in her life without ever stopping to wonder about the pale yellow house set back from the road behind a row of overgrown arborvitae. It listed his next of kin as one Helen Ruel, wife. And it was signed, in the lower right corner, by a physician named Dr. Paul Ehrman of Geisinger Community Medical Center, who had since retired and moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. What it did not explain was the library card. What it did not explain was the weekly visits. What it did not explain was the 11 years of checkout records, 32 signed transactions per year, 352 in total, each one bearing his name in that same steady, unhurried handwriting that matched the signature on the death certificate with forensic precision. Detective Sandra Qualo of the Dunmore Police Department was 43 years old and had, as her colleagues frequently noted, the professional skepticism of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades watching ordinary people do extraordinary things to one another. She did not rattle easily. She had worked a double homicide in 2014, a missing child case in 2011 that had taken 8 months and ended badly, and 17 years of the slow, grinding procedural work that never made the news. She was not a person who used the word strange lightly. She used it 4 times in the first 10 minutes of her conversation with Margaret Voss. Qualo pulled the case file herself. She confirmed the death certificate. She confirmed the address. She ran Thomas Ruel's name through every database available to her and found what you would expect to find. A social security number that had been deactivated in September 2008. A vehicle registration that had lapsed the same year. A property record showing that 14 Carbondale Road had been sold by Helen Ruel in early 2009, approximately 4 months after her husband's death. Helen Ruel had relocated to a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida, where she was still living. Qualo noted that detail. She would need it later. What she could not confirm, what she could not begin to account for, was the library card. The Dunmore Public Library issued cards in 1987 on a standard form common to Lackawanna County's public library system. Cards were renewed every 5 years, which meant that whoever had been using Thomas Ruel's card after his death had either been renewing it successfully under his name or, and this was the detail that made Qualo set down her coffee cup, the card had never been renewed at all. She checked the renewal records herself. The last renewal on file for Thomas Ruel's library card was dated March 1992. 16 years before his death. 27 years before Margaret Voss picked up her phone and called the police. An expired card. Used continuously for 27 years, the last 11 of them by a man who was clinically, officially, and irrevocably dead. The library's circulation system should have flagged it. Every checkout transaction ran the card number through the database, which was supposed to reject expired credentials automatically. The system had been upgraded in 2003, again in 2010, and again in 2016. 3 complete overhauls. And yet every Thursday for 11 years, the checkout processed without error, without a flag, without a single automated rejection. The IT contractor who had managed the 2016 upgrade, a man named Kevin Bray working out of Scranton, told Qualo over the phone that what she was describing was not a glitch. It was not a loophole. It was, in his exact words, not possible within the architecture of that system. A card that expired in 1992 could not have generated successful checkout transactions in 2019. The system would not have allowed it. It had allowed it 352 times. Qualo drove to Dunmore Public Library on October 8, 5 days after Margaret's call, and asked to see the physical copy of The Long Dry Season. Catalog number F441. Margaret retrieved it from the hold shelf. It had been returned the previous Thursday, October 3rd, the same morning Margaret had made her discovery, and placed it on the desk between them. Qualo opened it. The inside front cover bore the library's ownership stamp and, below it, a small pocket that had once held a paper checkout card before the computerized system replaced it in the mid-90s. Libraries had stopped using those paper cards decades ago. The pocket should have been empty. It was standard practice to remove the old cards when the transition was made. This one wasn't empty. Inside the pocket was the original paper checkout card, the kind with rows for patron names and dates, the kind that hadn't been used since 1994 at the latest. It was filled in the same precise handwriting from top to bottom. Every row, every single borrowing recorded by hand, in ink that did not age the way ink ages. Not yellowed, not faded, not brittle at the edges. The entries ran from February 1989 to the bottom of the card, where the rows ran out in handwriting that was identical across 30 years. The first entry read, *T. Ruel. February 9th, 1989. *. The last entry read, *T. Ruel. September 26, 2019. *. That was last Thursday, 6 days ago. 7 days before the man who had written it had been dead for 11 years. Qualo bagged the book as evidence. She photographed the card in situ. She called the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office and requested a meeting for the following morning. She drove back to the station, sat at her desk for a long time, and then pulled up the contact information for Helen Ruel in Boca Raton, Florida. The woman who answered the phone sounded elderly, slightly hard of hearing, cheerful in the way that people become when they have survived enough loss that cheerfulness is the only architecture left. Qualo identified herself and asked, gently, a few preliminary questions about Thomas Ruel's final weeks, his habits, whether he had been a reader. Helen Ruel said yes, absolutely. Thomas had loved books. He had been a member of that library since the 80s. He had, she said, with a note in her voice that Qualo couldn't quite categorize, particularly loved one book. A novel. She couldn't remember the title. Something about dry weather, she thought. Qualo asked when Helen had last been in contact with anyone from Dunmore. There was a pause on the line. Then Helen Ruel said something that Qualo would repeat verbatim to 3 different investigators over the following months, each time watching their faces do the same thing her own face had done. She said that a man had come to see her in Boca Raton in August of this year, August 2019, asking questions about Thomas. About the library. About the book. She had assumed he was a researcher of some kind, or perhaps an old friend. She had spoken with him for nearly an hour. She had shown him photographs. Qualo asked her to describe the man. Helen Ruel described, in careful and unhurried detail, a man in his 60s with dark hair, slightly too neat. A gray jacket that looked one season too light for the Florida heat. Hands that she noticed, when he shook hers at the door, were very cold. She said he had introduced himself, and that she had thought it was strange at the time, though she couldn't say why it had unsettled her the way it did, the way a perfectly ordinary thing can unsettle you when something beneath it is sitting wrong. He had given his name as Thomas. And somewhere in the pause that followed, Margaret Voss, who was sitting across the desk from Qualo, who had insisted on being present for the call, whose hands were now flat on the table as if she needed to feel something solid, looked up, and Qualo watched the color leave her face entirely. Because Margaret had just remembered something she hadn't told anyone yet. Something she had filed away in the back of her mind, the way you file away small things that feel wrong but not wrong enough to name. The previous Thursday, October 3rd, 2019, the morning she had typed his name into the search bar and found the death certificate, the morning the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Thomas Ruel had come in at 10:15, as he always did. He had returned the book. He had checked it out again. He had nodded his brief, formal nod. And then he had paused at the door. Something he had never done in 11 years. He had turned back. He had looked at her across the length of the circulation desk, with that face she could never quite reconstruct from memory, and he had said, quietly, without expression, in a voice she was only now realizing she had never actually heard before that morning. He had said, I think this will be the last one. And then he had walked out into the October morning, and Margaret had sat very still for a moment before reaching for her keyboard, and neither of them had known, or perhaps one of them had known perfectly well, that by the time her search results loaded, everything that followed was already in motion. Detective Qualo ended the call with Helen Ruel. She looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at her. The Thursday after that conversation was October 10, 2019. Thomas Ruel did not come in. He had not come in the Thursday after that either, or any Thursday since. The copy of the Long Dry Season, catalog number F441, was still sitting in the evidence locker at the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office. It had not been returned to the library. The hold shelf where it had lived for 11 years stood empty. And on the morning of November 14, 2019, Margaret Voss did not come in to open the library. She did not call. She did not answer her phone. Her sister Carol, who had a spare key to the house on Prospect Avenue, drove over at noon and found all 9 navy blue cardigans hanging in the closet, the ceramic dish of butterscotch candies still on the kitchen table, and a single book lying open on the couch. It was not a library book. It had no catalog number. It had no publication information, no author name, no ISBN printed anywhere in its pages. But Carol recognized the cover, a faded watercolor of cracked earth beneath a white sun. And on the page it was open to, in the margin, in handwriting that Carol had never seen before but that the forensic examiner would later confirm did not match any known sample in the case file. Not Margaret's, not Thomas Ruel's, not anyone's on record. Someone had written a single sentence. Carol photographed it before the investigators arrived. She has never read it aloud to anyone. She has given one interview in 5 years, to a local journalist named Patrick Dre who was working on a piece about her sister's disappearance. And when Dre asked her what the sentence said, Carol Voss set down her glass of water, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out the window for a very long time. Then she said, "You wouldn't print it." And Dre, who had been a journalist for 19 years and thought he had heard most things, told me later that what unsettled him most was not what Carol had said. It was the way she said it. Not distressed. Not dramatic. Just certain. The way you are certain about something you have already decided you will carry alone. The Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office case file on Thomas Ruel remains open. Margaret Voss has not been found. And every Thursday morning at 10:15, the circulation desk at the Dunmore Public Library sits unstaffed for exactly 4 minutes. No one has been able to explain that either. What happened to Margaret Voss did not make the national news. It made 3 paragraphs in the Scranton Times-Tribune, a brief mention on a local radio segment, and a single thread on a true crime forum that was locked by a moderator after 48 hours without explanation. The official classification is still a missing persons case. The official position of the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office is that the investigation is ongoing. Neither of those statements tells you anything. And I think, by now, you know that the absence of an explanation is itself a kind of answer. Let me tell you what the investigators actually found. And let me tell you what they couldn't bring themselves to put in the report. In the weeks following Margaret's disappearance in November 2019, Detective Sandra Qualo submitted a formal request to access the full archival records of the Dunmore Public Library. Not just the digital checkout logs, but the physical ledgers that predated the computerized system, the handwritten intake forms, the original membership registrations going back to the library's founding. Those records were stored in the basement, in a room that smelled of mildew and old binding glue, in cardboard boxes that had not been opened in years. What Qualo found in those boxes took her 3 days to work through. And when she was done, she filed a supplementary report that her supervisor, Lieutenant Gary Merrick, later told a colleague he had read 4 times before he could decide whether to attach it to the case file or simply set it on fire. He attached it. Thomas Ruel's library membership application from 1987 was there, yellowed and perfectly preserved. His handwriting on that form matched every subsequent signature. Expected. What was not expected was the page directly behind it. A nearly identical membership form, same format, same typeface, same library header. A form that predated the 1987 design by at least 15 years, placing it somewhere in the early 1970s. And on that form, in the same handwriting, was the same name. Thomas Ruel. A different address. Same signature. Qualo cross-referenced the address. It was a property on Wheeler Street that had been demolished in 1981. No record of a Thomas Ruel residing there. No utility records, no tax filings, no electoral roll entry. The man on that form existed only on that form. As he had existed, it seemed, only in the library. Qualo then did something that had not occurred to anyone in the previous weeks of the investigation. She searched the library's oldest surviving ledger, a cloth-bound volume from 1961, recording the earliest membership registrations for the Dunmore Public Library after its founding, for the name Ruel. She found it on page 47. Thomas Ruel. Different address again. A street that no longer exists, swallowed by a highway expansion in 1969. Membership date, March 4, 1961. Signature in the column beside the name, in an ink that was faded but legible. The same handwriting. Qualo is not a person given to dramatic statements. She is methodical, grounded, and in 17 years of police work had never once written anything in a case file that she could not support with evidence. The final paragraph of her supplementary report read as follows, and I am reading it to you verbatim from a copy obtained through a public records request filed in February 2024. She wrote, based on the totality of the documentary evidence reviewed, I am unable to determine the identity or nature of the individual using the name Thomas Ruel. I am unable to determine how this individual accessed library services across a period that, if the 1961 ledger entry is authentic, spans at minimum 58 years. I am unable to account for the consistency of the handwriting across that period or for the failure of multiple computerized systems to register anomalies in the patron record. I am noting for the record that I have no satisfactory investigative framework within which to place these findings, and I am recommending that the physical records be preserved and the case remain open pending further review. I am also noting, as I believe it is relevant, that I have driven past 14 Carbondale Road on 3 occasions since this investigation began. On each occasion, the lights in the pale yellow house have been on. The property has been vacant since its sale in 2009. Nobody has gone inside. As for the book, the copy of the long dry season that sat in the evidence locker at the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office. It was logged, photographed, and sealed in an evidence bag on October 8, 2019. The bag was intact. The seal was unbroken. When an evidence clerk named Dennis Farrow went to retrieve it in January 2020 for a forensic document examination that Qualo had requested, the bag was there. The seal was there. The book was not inside it. In its place was the paper checkout card, removed from the front pocket of the book and lying flat in the center of the empty bag. The entries were the same as before, running from February 1989 down to September 26, 2019. Except that there was one new entry at the very bottom, below the last printed row, written in the margin of the card in that same unfaded ink. *T. Ruel. November 14, 2019. The date Margaret Voss disappeared. Nobody can explain how the entry got there. Nobody can explain where the book went. And when forensic document examiner Ruth Callahan analyzed the photograph of the marginal inscription from Carol's image, the sentence in the book that was open on Margaret's couch, the sentence that Carol Voss has never read aloud, Callahan submitted her own quiet finding. The handwriting on the couchbook's margin was not a match to Thomas Ruel's known samples. It was not a match to Margaret's. It was not a match to anyone in the database. But it was, she noted with careful understatement, structurally consistent with someone who had been taught to write by someone who wrote exactly the way Thomas Ruel wrote. The way a student resembles a teacher. The way an echo resembles a voice. Patrick Dre, the journalist who interviewed Carol, spent 18 months working on a long-form piece about the case. He spoke to Qualo 3 times. He submitted records requests to Lackawanna County, to Geisinger Medical Center, to the retirement community in Boca Raton where Helen Ruel lived. In December 2020, he drove to Florida. Helen Ruel agreed to meet him. He sat with her for 2 hours in a sunlit common room and asked her everything he could think to ask. At the end of the interview, he asked if she had heard from the man who had visited her in August 2019, the man who had called himself Thomas, with the dark hair and the cold hands and the gray jacket. Helen Ruel was quiet for a moment. Then she said yes. She had received a letter, postmarked November 2019, no return address. Contained no message. It contained a single photograph, a black and white image, slightly blurred, of the interior of a library, a circulation desk, a ceramic dish of what appeared to be small wrapped candies. In the background, barely visible, a woman sat behind the desk with her hair pinned back in a loose bun, looking down at something the camera couldn't see. Helen told Dre she had not recognized the woman, but she had recognized the room. She had been inside the Dunmore Public Library once, in 1991, when she had come to pick Thomas up after his car had a flat tire. She remembered the flickering light above the desk. She remembered thinking the building felt very old, in a way that had nothing to do with its construction date. Dre asked her what she had done with the photograph. She had mailed it to Detective Qualo. Qualo had added it to the case file. The photograph has since been analyzed, and the woman in the background has been provisionally identified, based on build and hairstyle, as Margaret Voss. The photograph was taken in 2019. It has the grain and tonal quality of film developed in the 1970s. Here is what I believe, for whatever that is worth, and I want to be honest with you about the fact that belief is all anyone has left when the evidence runs out. I believe that Thomas Ruel was, at some point, a real man. I believe he died in August 2008, as the death certificate states, in a house on Carbondale Road in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, with a library card in his wallet and a book he had been meaning to return. I believe that whatever walked into that library on September 6, 2008, and every Thursday for 11 years after that, was something shaped by that man's habits and routines and unfinished rituals, the way water is shaped by the vessel it once filled. I believe that Margaret Voss understood something in those final weeks, something that the checkout records and the forensic reports and the supplementary case files are all circling without ever landing on. And I believe that what she understood, she chose. Not because she had to, but because she had spent her entire adult life inside that building, caring for its books, tending to its routines, and perhaps, in 11 years of Thursdays, had come to care for one particular patron in a way that doesn't have a name in any language designed for the living. The hold shelf where the long dry season lived for 11 years is still empty. The butterscotch candies are still in the ceramic dish, restocked by a colleague who thought it was the right thing to do. The fluorescent light above the circulation desk still flickers at its irregular rhythm, the same rhythm it has kept since 2007, and no one has fixed it, and no one will. And every Thursday morning at 10:15 for 4 minutes, the building holds a particular quality of silence that the staff have learned not to discuss with one another. Not from fear exactly, more the way you don't discuss something that belongs to someone else. A quietness that has been there long enough to have earned its place. Margaret Voss has not been found. The case file remains open. Somewhere in Boca Raton, Helen Ruel keeps a photograph that was taken before the camera that took it existed. And somewhere in the evidence archive of the Lackawanna County Sheriff's Office, a paper checkout card records the name of a man who kept his word about returning what he borrowed every single week, long past the point where the debt should have been forgiven. The last line of Gerald Fitch's novel The Long Dry Season, the only line from the book that anyone in this investigation thought to look up, found in a digitized excerpt in a university archive, reads as follows. Asterisk, he had not come back for the water. He had come back because he had forgotten how to be anywhere else. Asterisk. Make of that what you will. Every week, Mindshift Stories brings you the cases that keep investigators awake at night, the ones too disturbing for mainstream media. If that sounds like something you need, subscribe now and never miss a story.